Good evening, everyone. Tim Addict. So we touched upon step 11 last week. We did, I think, a line because we were preoccupied with step 10. So the paragraph, the first one, much has already been said about receiving strength, inspiration, and direction from him who has all knowledge and power. That's God, by the way. That's who he means there. And we discussed that last week. If we have carefully followed directions, in other words, taken the preceding steps, we have, and it's interesting, you don't have to follow them well, you just have to follow them carefully, and there's a difference. I've said this before, but if you got one of those princess cakes, a picture of one of those princess cakes with a recipe, and, for a girl's birthday or something, with all the turrets and a little dragon coming over the top, and you sat at home and you carefully followed the instructions, what you ended up with might not look very much like the princess cake in the picture. In fact, there are whole television shows devoted to the comedy of how people who try really hard at difficult things make a complete hash of it. They call things like nailed it. And it's like that with the programme. Your job is not to do it well, your job is to do it carefully. So if I've done the first 11 steps carefully, the results might be comical, but that's the price of entry, is doing it carefully, not doing it well. It says, if we've done this, we have begun to sense the flow of his spirit into us. To some extent, we have become God conscious. We have begun to develop this vital sixth sense, but we must go further, and that means more action. Now, the sixth sense, it's difficult to talk about this. It's, I think, a sense of what is right and wrong, what the thing to do is in a situation, which comes to you in a flash. I remember at my home group a while ago, I think my home group is very good, not because we talk about the big book, but because schizophrenics feel comfortable there. They feel looked after. And there was someone who was having a bit of a difficult afternoon. Let's say he's called Clive. He wasn't called Clive. And he was starting to play up, and it was starting to get a little bit disruptive. And one of the group members clocked what was happening and went over and said something very quiet to him, and he sat down. This person instinctively knew what to do. Complex situation, lots of moving parts, a lot going on, caught by surprise, but this person knew exactly what to do, and he was as good as gold and went and sat down. That's the sixth sense, and it can't be second-guessed rationally. You can maybe explain afterwards why it is, what experiences you had, which might have left you in a position that you've got this sixth sense. But it's not fully explicable by those past experiences. It involves a real presence of mind and spirit, and it requires one to have no radio interference from one's own ego in that moment. It says then, but we must go further, and that means more action. Now, it's so interesting. It's going to suggest that step 11 is an action step. Now, I've got a lot of sympathy for that wonderful idea to encourage meditation. Don't just do something, sit there. It's brilliant. There are times where that is right, that I need to stop and pause and think. But step 11 really is an action step, and it's much more vigorous, we'll see, than the contemporary word meditation might suggest. So next paragraph, step 11 suggests prayer and meditation. Now, one thing to remember is what came first is the Oxford groups, and then that gave rise to AA, as it were, in the womb of the Oxford groups, and then AA, as it were, gives birth to itself and separates itself off. And so the practices of prayer and meditation we've got in AA weren't developed by AA. They don't come from within AA. They come from the Oxford group. And there might be little adaptations and dumbings down for us dumb addicts. But essentially it came from outside. Now, it came in 1935. The book gets published, I believe, in April 1939. And Bill had the most frightful struggle with AA members about the early chapters. And I'm not a historian, but I understand the conversation went something like this, where Bill said, "You want me to write this, do you? Good. You need to butt out of it. Leave me to do it, or I'm not going to do it." And they said, "Okay, you win. We're going to stop arguing. We'll review the final copy when it goes out, but you go and write it." And one evening, Bill goes to write the passages with which we're so familiar in chapter 5. Now, it got heavily edited later on. The beginning of chapter 5 is one of the most radically altered sections in terms of tone. The tone was very different in the first version. But at this point, they had a 6-step program. And Bill went away and he did a bit of writing and he came back the next day and said, here are the steps we took. And there are 12 of them. So overnight, they've sort of replicated like rabbits or something. So into Bill's experience went 6 steps. Out of his pen came 12. Now, the reason I'm saying this is the practices were there for 4 years. And Bill slaps the phrase prayer and meditation on top of the practices after the event. And the reason that's important, he didn't start by saying, "I know, let's do prayer and meditation now. What on earth are those?" And then write a few twizzles in the book. The twizzles in the book on steps 10 and 11, particularly step 11, the material in the book on step 11 came first as a set of practices handed down, and after the event, it was referred to as prayer and meditation. Now, what this means is we have absolutely no basis for bringing our own understanding of the word prayer or our own understanding of the word meditation to our understanding of step 11. In other words, you can leave the words prayer and meditation out of it. You can learn what the book says, you can do what the book says, and then afterwards you say, "And that, ladies and gentlemen, is prayer and meditation." Now, the prayer bit, prayer, if you go to morning prayer in the Church of England and listen to the Book of Common Prayer, there is almost no petitionary prayer. There is almost no asking. And there's very, very little in terms of asking God what to do today. Almost none of it. Most of it is describing God or praising God and praying for the world and praying for the king and praying for Princess Anne and praying for whoever else. I can never remember who's on the list. You pray for all of these things. So even prayer, you'd think that would be straightforward, but the prayer that's described in the book is very narrow, very specific. The meditation in the book appears to have almost nothing to do with the contemporary understanding. So we're to take the book at its word and do what the book says and afterwards say, and that is what we're going to call prayer and meditation. So it says next, we shouldn't be shy on this matter of prayer. Better men than we are using it constantly. It works if we have the proper attitude and work at it. Now that's a brilliant line. A lot of these lines where they say, if you do this, then this will happen, can be used backwards. In other words, it says it works if we have the proper attitude and work at it. Condition number 1, proper attitude. Condition number 2, work at it. If we do that, it'll work. That means if you're doing what it says on pages 86 to 88 and you're not getting the results it promises, there's something wrong if I'm doing that. There's something wrong with my attitude, or I'm not putting the time in. So all of those promises can point the finger back. If I'm not getting the promise, I must not be fulfilling the condition properly. There's a great line in the 12 and 12 where it says almost the only scoffers at prayer are the people who haven't tried it enough. And that's wonderful, because you can't fail with that. You just have to carry on until you try. There's no way out of that. Very cleverly written little line. Right, what is the proper attitude? The proper attitude is to understand the purpose of step 11, which is, I think, very well described on page 59. I want to get out of step 11, not necessarily feeling better. In fact, that's not the aim at all. Praying only for knowledge of God's will for me and the power to carry that out. And sometimes people will say, I don't know if God's will is for me to ditch this career and go and live in, Korea, and I don't know, make soup or something for people living on the streets in Korea. I don't know. But what's God's will for me? That's a very grand decision. Now, let's say God's will really is for you to go and work in a soup kitchen in Korea. God's will isn't accessed by a yes or no on that huge decision. It's accessed day by day. So maybe go on holiday to Korea to find out if you actually like the place. Maybe learn some Korean. Maybe learn to make soup. Maybe find out if there are people living on the streets in Korea who need soup made for them. There are hundreds of individual steps. So I don't really find out what God's will is by asking very big questions. I find out what God wants me to do between 9:05 and 9:10 this morning or this evening. That's the level. So the proper attitude is to maintain the humility of seeking only what does God want me to do today, and the oomph, the power to carry that out. That's the attitude. And working at it simply means giving it the time. That's all. It then says, it would be easy to be vague about this matter, yet we believe we can make some definite and valuable suggestions. Now, people say the directions in the book are clear-cut. They're clear-cut when they decide to be. There are other bits where they're not. The most comical example of the book not being clear-cut is in chapter 7, where your little prospect has said that he decides that he wants to make the decision, step 3, and tell his story, step 5. And then it says, having had the experience yourself, you can give him much practical advice. That is the only line on sponsorship in the big book. It's clear cut, but only as far as it goes. It doesn't decide to go very far. Well, what do you mean, advice? Book is silent. Now, when the book is silent, it's Liberty Hall. As long as you stick with the principles of the book and what you do is consistent with the material that is there, knock yourself out. Unfortunately, when they say we can make some definite and valuable suggestions, it's constructing a much tighter cage to put me in. And either I follow the suggestions or I don't. I'll give you an example for later on. On Awakening, we ask God to direct our thinking. Either I'm saying, God, please direct my thinking, or I'm not. Either I'm doing it, or there's no argument about that. Either I've said those words or I haven't. And if I'm not saying them, I'm not doing step 11 in the big book. Doesn't matter how much transcendental meditation I'm doing, I'm not doing the thing it's asking me to do. And one of the biggest complaints that I've made in recovery over the years, and I've heard lots of other people do this, is say, but I've been sober and clean and whatever. avoiding peanut butter for 7 years, 15 years, and I still have feelings and character defects, and no one will talk to me, and I hate everyone, and I haven't got any money, and I smell, and things like that. And the idea is, if the program was going to work, it would have worked by now. And then you say, did you ask God this morning to direct your thinking? No! And you discover, and then you say, have you reminded yourself many times each day that you are no longer running the show? Well, no. When was the last time you said that? I can't remember. And then you want to say, well, should we do it the other way around? It doesn't seem you're doing much of what the programme is suggesting. Maybe you could tell us something from the big book you are doing, because we're struggling to find anything here. And one of the big... I'm such an awful... I'm going to say an awful thing now, so forgive me in advance, if you would. There's an awful lot in AA of devising special advanced programs for people who want to have new experiences or deeper experiences or special experiences, or do it the Clarence Snyder way, or do it the back to basics way, or do it the this way or the that way, as though what's in the book isn't going to work. And the trouble with anything but the book is it may be very good, it may even be better. I'm not going to question that. Maybe Big Book Awakening is better than just using the book and reading the book and doing what it says. But the use of a different system is briefing against the book within the fellowship. It's saying, if you want a real experience, if you really want to solve your problems at a number of years, clean or sober, you have to do this special thing. And the real alarm, the real red flag, is the workbook you have to buy or the CDs you have to pay for. If you see any of those, just run a mile, run 1,000 miles in the opposite direction, and don't give it a moment's thought. If someone's charging for this, that's not what we do. If it's not given for fun and for free, it's snake oil. Really basic. Now, one of my real influencing persons in AA, most of the people who've influenced me the most I've never met, and influenced me, as it were, from beyond the grave, not through some Ouija board or Madame Arcati-like experience, but simply through the medium of the recorded word, either things that they've written or things that they've said that I've heard on tapes. And one of the great ones is Paul Martin from Chicago, who died with over 60 years sobriety, and I love his talks because they're dull. He's not trying to impress you. He's one of the only speakers that I've heard who clearly doesn't care if you're enjoying yourself. He just wants to give you some information. He perfunctorily does a couple of little jokes at the beginning because they've asked him to. But he just sets out material. I love it. And what he says is, 15 or 16 years sober, he discovered that what he needed to do was not some special, it talks about it in the book, alluring bypaths or something like that. What he needed to do was just exactly what it said in the book, and that is it. So when I'm in trouble, I pretend I'm really dumb and I don't know anything, and I pretend the book will work if I just do what's in the book. And so, like a dummy, I sit there in the morning saying, God, please direct my thinking. Please divorce my thinking from self-pity, self-seeking, dishonest motives. Then I do all the other things. I just do it mechanically. And you know what? Within 48 hours, 75% of the mental crap gone. Then I can see what's left and start to deal with it. If in doubt, just do what it says, and do it for long enough until the heat is let out of the system. You don't need a special sponsor. You don't need a special program. You don't need special all sorts of twizzles and bells and whistles. Unnecessary. So what's going to follow the suggestions really are valuable. And suggestion, as ever, does not mean it's optional if you want the results. It means no one's going to force you. That's all suggestions means. So, we're going to get on to the nightly review. Now, if your sponsor is currently telling you to do something different than this, I don't want to stop you. So I think it's a good idea in general to do what your sponsor says and complete the course of action until you've gone through all 12 steps and then decide maybe. Better than chopping and changing. And I heard someone say they'd heard something I'd said on a tape which was different than their sponsor said, and they phoned me up and they said, I called out my sponsor. I thought, oh God, don't do that. You mean condemned. To call someone out is a polite modern word for saying to condemn and moralize. Don't do that. So anyway, what I'm going to say is simply how I read the book, and what I do. And if it's helpful, you might be doing it already, you might decide to do it, or you might keep the information for later and switch later on. So no panic reactions to this. When we retire at night, we constructively review our day. Now, to retire at night, almost everyone in the contemporary world seems to read that as in the last 14 seconds before falling asleep. I don't read it that way. I think when the business of the day is done, front door is shut, phone pulled out of the wall in the old days, you're done. You're ready to relax and just wind down. We're talking early evening, not late at night. If you want to do it late at night, fine. If your mind works late at night, good for you. Mine doesn't. I'm gone. If I'm going to do this, when it's night time, the day is done. When does night fall? Night falls somewhere between mid-afternoon and early evening in most latitudes. So when the day is done, and in the Jewish day, the day starts at sundown. So the day is not from morning to night, it's from sundown to sundown. So the review. When the business of the day is done, I like to then do the review and give myself a nice evening. If there are some real corkers and doozies, I do not want to wait until 10 to 11 to spirit them up again, upset myself, and give myself a horrid night's sleep. I want to deal with this stuff in the early evening, in the beginning of the night, as it were, so that I can have a nice rest of the evening and go to sleep having kind of calmed down if it's been a difficult day. And it says, now, don't forget also the context of this. This is under the heading of prayer and meditation. Now, which one's which? If something is a prayer, i.e. a petition or a thanking to God, almost all of the prayer in this is petitionary, or a statement of God's position, for instance, God running the show. If it's a prayer, then it's a prayer. Anything else comes under the heading of meditation. So this is a meditation section. It ain't an inventory section, it's a meditation section, which has as its content some inventory questions. So the content is inventory, but the form is meditation. Form and content are different questions. So it's a meditation. And step 11 is all about God. So this is a meditation in the presence of God. Now, I'm going to say something that it doesn't say in this passage. Two of the things it doesn't say is to write anything down It doesn't say to send it to anyone. Now, if you're doing those and it's helping you, good for you. But I've stopped doing writing. Whatever I write down, I make real to myself. And if I go through the worst bits of the day and write down the worst bits of the day, what I'm doing is making the worst bits of the day real to me. I'm making them my whole day. There's a passage in Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, I think it's in that rather than Through the Looking Glass, where, I won't get this quotation exact, the Red King says, "The horror of that moment I shall never, ever forget." And the Red Queen says, "Oh, but you will if you don't make a memorandum of it." And a memorandum is literally that which is to be remembered. Like Amanda is she who is to be loved. That ending, that's what it means. So a memorandum is that which is to be remembered. At the end of the day, the absolute last thing I want to do is make a memorandum of the things that have gone wrong. Our purpose is the opposite. It's to offer these up to God. If I've got something wrong, I don't know how to get it right, or I lack the strength. So it is not my business. It is God's business. I'm to yield the things up to God and say, I'm out of ideas. If I wasn't, this wouldn't have gone wrong. So that's the general atmosphere of this. We constructively review our day. Now that's going to cover a couple of things. And notice constructively review our day. So the day ends, and then we have the evening and the night, two different periods. I have a cut-off. After a certain time, I won't look at my phone except incoming calls. None of it. I need a few hours to calm down, for the energy of the day to dissipate. I'm not agitated, but I need the energy of the day to dissipate. We constructively review our day. What does that mean? The purpose of step 11 is to improve my step 12. So I want to learn a few things. I want to clear the decks so that my consciousness is cleared. The first 9 steps clear my consciousness so that I'm just buzzing along, having a nice time, not really thinking about anything. During the day, things build up. You want to pull the lever, flush everything out, or flush everything up to God. So the constructively, this is not an attack on myself. It is a release of what hasn't worked in order to create the space to be shown by God a different way. So the focus of the step 11 is the different way. The premise, the prerequisite, is I have to have a glance at what went wrong, release those things to God. Then it's constructive. I can't tell you how often I've seen people say, and I've said it myself, I'm writing the same thing day after day in my nightly review or my step 10, however people are terming it, and nothing's changing. Well, of course, because you're cementing those things into your consciousness. That's why they're not leaving, because you're making memoranda of them. Now, the next line is a very good test of can I speak English. What it says is, were we resentful, selfish, dishonest, or afraid? First of all, we, not I. Which means I'm considering myself as part of a humanity. that resents and is selfish and dishonest and afraid. It's rather like the collective confession. You get the Al-Chetz on Yom Kippur. You get the collective confession in the evensong service in the Book of Common Prayer, which has the wonderful line, "And there is no health in us." I love it. It's very good. Now, do you remember at school when you did examinations, the teacher would always give the scripts back and everyone had got 12%. And the teacher says, "That'll teach you not to read the question." Well, it seems most of us weren't paying attention when the teacher said that, because you see, the way I read that question a long time ago was, "Please detail at enormous length the precise ways in which you are resentful, selfish, dishonest, and afraid, and discuss them at eye-watering length with anyone who will listen." And it doesn't say that, mercifully. It says, were we resentful, selfish, dishonest, or afraid? And the type of question here admits only one of two answers, yes or no. There are four elements. Was I resentful? Yes or no. Was I selfish? Yes or no. Was I dishonest? Yes or no. Was I afraid? Yes or no. It's not asking for detail. Would have. Look at how much detail it asks you for on pages 63 to 67 on resentment. It's asking a different question here. Now, I might cast over the day at the fact I was resentful. I would have to remember glancing the specific situations. I let my mind just tap on the top of its head each situation where I was resentful, selfish, dishonest, or afraid, and on that basis, I'll say yes or no to each of those questions. Now, there's one bit where it doesn't discuss the severity. Now, of course, on any given day, even the most pious person will find something that mildly annoyed them, or they put themselves first when they could have put someone else first. I think there's only any value in identifying the big things. If you're just going to automatically say every day for the rest of your life, "Yes, I was these awful things," and you're not learning anything. Being universally guilty is just as much of a distortion as being universally innocent. It's no good in an inventory saying, "I have all of the character defects." No, pick the ones which are the doozies, because those will tell us what you're really like. So I'm looking for the doozies. Remember that during the day, I'm supposed to have been doing step 10 to get these things, to clear these things out of the system. If you'll pardon a rather disagreeable image, but a helpful one, during the course of the day, of course, one blows one's nose on tissues and throws them away in the bin. This step 11 review at night is not an exercise of going through the bin and unfurling all of the tissues to see what happened at various points during the day. It's not an invitation to re-enter the fray, to pore over all of these incidents. But what I want to look at is the main things. And a couple of minutes is enough to say, where was I? Was I afraid? Yes, I was afraid of this and that. What was I resentful of? Oh, I was annoyed at this email from the university. I was annoyed at this thing I heard on the radio. Good, you're done. Because now you can say, yes, I was resentful. Yes, I was frightened. And that's the end of it. Next question. Do we owe an apology? You sit with that for a moment. If you do, it should have been made already. So this should only be catching the things which haven't been caught during the day? Have we kept something to ourselves which should be discussed with another person at once? Again, this should have been dealt with. This question is there to catch anything. It's like a second layer. It's like if you'll pardon the expression, a second nappy to catch what the first nappy doesn't catch. So the step 10 should be catching everything as you go along, but occasionally things, as it were, slip through. Will be kind and loving toward all. Again, binary question. One or the other. Either I was or I wasn't. And if you weren't, you'll know there'll be specific doozies which come to mind. We're not after some sort of bizarre perfection here. We're after ordinary, good and honest, regular relations with other people. We know when we've been out of line. And that's really what it's talking about here. This is not an exercise in ever-increasing piety, ever-decreasing circles, looking for... There's a wretched bit in the 12 and 12, where it says, even if you've done very well, I'm sure you can find even more minor character defects to work on. And I don't like the atmosphere of that. I think the big book wants us to be happy, joyous and free, not endlessly scratching at ourselves, looking for yet more things that are wrong. I know someone who's one of these... Have you ever met in AA one of those apologisers that's always apologising for everything and remaking amends to the same family members again and again and again until such point that they say, please stop making amends, and then the person makes amends for keeping making amends. An apology, you don't want to be like that. We don't scrape, we don't crawl before people. So this is really supposed to pick out important things. It's not scratching yourself until you bleed. Now, the next two questions... next question. What could we have done better? Now, that's a very constructive one. Notice how the problems are identified with binary. Yes, no. Were you selfish? Yes, no. Were we kind and loving toward all? Yes or no. But look at the next one. What could we have done better? That's asking not for a yes, no, but for a substantive response. So the meditation is not poring over what went wrong, but figuring out what would have been a better response in that situation. So you're only momentarily looking at the negative, you're chiefly looking at the positive. Everything up to now could take 20 seconds. This could take 5 minutes. Now, the next two you take together. We'll be thinking of ourselves most of the time, or we'll be thinking of what we could do for others, of what we could pack into the stream of life. Those operate as the two ends of a scale. So you're really pitting yourself. Where was I on that scale from this end to that end? So I take them together. But what they also do, as is often the case, the book squeezes in through the back door principles which are not actually set out anywhere else in the book. So it's very explicit. It's telling me, it's implying, rather rudely, that I shouldn't be thinking of myself. It's also implying I should be thinking two things. What could we do for others? What can I pack into the stream of life? By the way, we're going to finish today at the end of this paragraph in a few minutes, so feel free to start thinking about questions, popping them in the chat so we can segue directly into the chat when we get there. It'll still be a few minutes. Now, I get a lot done in my life. It's taken a while to get there. I was walking chaos in 1993 when I got clean. I get a lot done today, and there are two reasons. The first one is there ain't much going on in my mind, so I'm not wasting energy on stuff. I asked my other half once, when you walk to work, what do you think about? And he said, nothing. I said, what do you mean nothing? He said, nothing. Because he literally, nothing going on, just idling in a sort of pleasant way. Like when the engine is turning over when you're waiting outside a house for someone to come out. Just just little noises. Almost nothing. So you're saving the energy for when you need it. The other reason is someone gave the example of a teacher who says to a classroom, here's a pot, and he shows the children the pot, and it's full of potatoes. And he says, what's it full of? And they said, full of potatoes. He said, you think it's full? They said, yes. Then he takes some chickpeas, some dried chickpeas, pours them, and of course they go in between the gaps left by the potatoes, and it's up to the top, full of chickpeas now, as well as potatoes. And he says, is it full now? And they say, yes. They haven't got wise to what's happening. And so gradually he adds other things. He discovers you can get some rice in between the chickpeas. And then you can get some spices and some condiments in. And then he says, surely it's full now. And then he adds the water. It's amazing how much you can get in between the cracks. Listening to things, reading things, saying little prayers. People say they haven't got time for things. If you look at the time that's wasted, and then you look at the time when there is nothing going on, which could be fruitfully used, it's amazing how much more you can get done, what more you can pack into the stream of life. Now, in that story, he goes on to say there's still an ingredient missing, and the children say, what's the ingredient that's missing? They're bored now of the story. Heat. Heat is the thing that's missing. Now, a little digression, if you'll permit it. There's a passage in the Doctor's hallowed opinion where he says that modern medicine or modern science is unable to harness the powers of good that lie outside our synthetic knowledge. And it's a difficult passage. Essentially, he's saying, this moral psychology, we doctors could try to spoon feed that to alcoholics and addicts until they're blue in the face, but it won't make the blindest bit of difference. It won't help them. Not this type. And the reason, it's like having the dry ingredients or even the wet ingredients for a stew, and you're stirring and stirring and stirring and nothing is happening because you need heat. What's different about AA is not the information, it's the heat. And if you read through the foreword to the second edition, there are a couple of fire images. The two that are used are organic images, particularly mushrooms. I think mushrooming is referred to twice. And heat and fire and light and sparks and things. It's the fire which makes it work. And the fire is the identification and the common humanity and being in the same room and being shoulder to shoulder on the path. That's the thing which turns the dry ingredients into a stew eventually. Now, back to this question. It's another test of, can I read English? Or were we thinking of what we could do for others, what we could pack into the stream of life? It's not asking me to tell the recipient of the review what I was packing into the stream of life. It's asking me about my thought life, what my thought life was concentrated on. Was it concentrated on the substance of what I'm contributing to the world, or is my thought life concentrated on myself, on my hitting of my deadlines, of my whatever, my receipt of money for the work that I do? So it's a question about the direction of thought. Is it inwards or is it outwards? Now, it says, but we must be careful not to drift into worry, remorse, or morbid reflection. He loves trios. Worry, remorse, or morbid reflection, for that would diminish our usefulness to others. Now, I find that a review that lasts more than 5 minutes is almost invariably going to drift into those, or scrupulosity, that's an excessively harsh or punishing attitude towards one's defects of character. It descends into grandiosity or pettiness, and both of those are to be avoided. If you can't find enough to work on in the first 5 minutes of the review, there can't be much there, frankly. It's there, it's sitting on a plate for you. People are frightened they're going to miss something. Whatever you've done has already gone anyway. So the purpose is not to go and recatch everything that's already gone. The river's gone past with all the crap in it. We're after major lessons here. So 5 or 10 minutes max. And you know what? If you're 2 minutes in and you're losing the plot, you're already your head is spinning out of control. Stop it and have another go tomorrow. You're not going to be turned into a pumpkin if you do this. Because you can't do it constructively if your head has gone. You need to be in a bit of a fit state to even do this. Last little bit. After making our review, we ask God's forgiveness. You do that by saying, God, please forgive me. That was easy, wasn't it? And inquire what corrective measures should be taken. Now, I think this is the only point at which the pen and pencil might come in. If the corrective measures are few enough for you to be able to memorize them, commit them to memory, and or action them straight away, then you won't need a pen and paper. Whereas you might need pen and paper if the corrective measures are coming through thick and fast. So the writing is not really part of it. The writing, if you do any at this point, is in order to carry the results through into the following day. And so the output of any Step 11 review I write, it's not a memoranda of all of the horrors, it's a list of ideals to work towards the next day. Or maybe a couple of people to call, just the names of the people to call or to apologise to. So the output is entirely constructive. And remember, you're in God's presence here. And I think I may have, I don't know if I said this last time, I forget what I've said on what occasion. If it's a repeat, then please excuse me. Hinduism, as we know, apparently has many gods, as do some other of the Asian religions, although it's understood in the mystical tradition that really these are representations and ultimately there is one God. These are different facets of a single God. And it's a little bit like that in Christianity. You've got people to choose from as the representatives of God. You've got the Trinity, the various aspects of the Trinity. Whatever works for you. A lot of people find it very helpful to visualize Jesus being with them or the Holy Spirit being with them. If you're not Christian, whatever. Do whatever works. But a bit of visualization to imagine God actually there in the chair opposite you. Some people even have, deceased relatives as the witness, and they know that that's not literally their higher power. People say, my deceased grandfather is my higher power. That's really shorthand for saying God is too abstract, but Gramps is not. Gramps was concrete. They can talk to him. It doesn't mean that Gramps has been deified and literally become the creator of the universe. People know that. People are not stupid. But I'd rather see someone talk to their grandfather who they believe in than an abstract God that they don't. Even if it's a bit of a sort of theological fiction and your local parish priest might cross himself if he heard about this. Some traditions caution against talking to the dead, and I understand the reasons for that. But if it works, if it helps, if it provides comfort, if it enables you to do this, so much the better. Being a human being is to be subject to all sorts of terrible limitations of imagination. Now, I'm not going to suggest that we all take psychedelics. I just want to report some scientific insight into what happens when psychedelics are taken. And I got this from there's a philosopher and computer scientist, PhD in both, called Bernardo Kastrup, Kastrup, who talks about the mind-body problem and the nature of consciousness. He's one of the foremost philosophers who is on the side of consciousness not just being an accidental byproduct of the physical brain, but a real thing which exists beyond the brain. And one of the things that he says is very interesting about psychedelics is that people who have psychedelic experiences have extremely rich experiences, flooded with sensation and content. So the amount of information that flows in one of those psychedelic experiences, it's very like, I'm told, in The Matrix, where Neo has the lead screwed into the back of his head and he has jujitsu downloaded into him or something in the course of a few seconds. This absolute flood of imagery and sensation and information and understanding. Now, if the physical brain were really correlated with the mind, then you would expect brain activity to absolutely explode, particularly in the frontal lobes, when people are on psychedelics. But you know what happens? It's the opposite. Lots of parts of the brain shut down, which enable these experiences. Now, if we're not taking psychedelics, and children we don't, because they're not good for people like us generally, you have to live with the limitations of being a human being. And part of that is being stuck with physicality, being stuck with the senses. And if you notice religions, if you pay a little bit of attention, how many religions use the physical senses? Sounds, bells, incense. You burn this, you burn that. Sometimes you burn witches, but we don't do that anymore. I don't think that was for the scent, though. That's a different type of burning, perhaps. But you get the point. The senses are invoked because we're too dumb as mammals to connect with God on this purely abstract plane. So to consider in the Step 11 review, it's not pen and paper, it's you sitting opposite God in an armchair, both having a cup of tea. Get used to being in the room with God, being able to talk to God, because you'll need it. Let me tell you, there are going to be times the only thing you've got is that relationship with God. It might be just a few minutes, or it could be a few months at some point. Start now, because you don't know when you're going to need it. Right, so, questions. If step 10 is done during the day, it should not be revisited at in step 11. Just a sec. If you've been doing step 10 during the day, in the step 11, all you're asked to do is glance at what the problems were, which become the domains in which God is going to give me corrective measures, not to be rehashed. So, I'll give you an example. Today, I got hot under the I teach a very, very small amount at a university, and the university, I won't say which one, partly out of embarrassment, um, but they send me these, well, they send everyone these endless emails, um, basically spamming us with seminars they want us to go to and all sorts of initiatives, and they're all very worthy and ideologically sound in the university's view. Least said the better. The point is, normally, when I'm in my right mind, I scan the list of emails, and unless something is directly addressed to me, I delete them all without looking at them. I made a mistake this morning. I opened one of them and I read it. I thought, Jesus H. Christ. This, it just really rubbed me up the wrong way. And so during the day, I thought, I've got to stop this. I'm not going to think about this. Now, I did make the mistake of screenshotting it and sending it to friends, one of whom works at a university and another one has got a lot of experience at universities. I wanted to get that in there before I got the corrective measures from God. You want to get the most out of it first. But then I said to God, look, I can't open this up again. I rubbed the genie's bottle earlier and it popped out, and I put it back, and now I'm doing it again. And God said, why don't you read a book on the topic so you're better informed? Because you're not well informed enough about this. So I downloaded a book, I'm listening to it, and it's actually, rather than fueling the flame, it's calming me down a bit. So I realise I'm not the only person to have this virulent reaction to a particular thing. There are some perfectly sound people who are reacting to this thing in the way that I am. So sometimes when you look at it later, you get a different take than you did in the step 10. Step 10 really is there to catch all of the small things. The step 11 review is to say, are there any more general changes in direction or attitude or approach or policy or procedure in my life? So step 10 is not really the step for making big decisions or making strategic change, tactical or strategic changes. Step 11 is. And sometimes I think it's helpful, I've done this, where in the corrective measures I limit myself to 3. Because if you change 3 things a day, that's 1,000 things a year, that's enough change. You don't need to make a list of 27, just pick the top 3 for that day. Step 11, someone says, in the 12 and 12 confuses me. It confuses all of us. So you're in terribly good company there. It talks about lying on a sunlit beach and taking breaths. Isn't that contrary to the big book? And isn't the peace prayer also contrary to asking only for knowledge of God's will for us? Is the peace prayer the Francis of Assisi prayer? I think that's maybe the one. Now, what you got to realise is the 12 and 12 is it's a very, very good commentary on the big book, or not on the big book, on the programme, with 20 years of hindsight. And I think it reflects it's not inauthentic, because I think it genuinely reflects a lot of the experience in the fellowship of AA. Now, the question is, how, if one is using the big book as one's basic method, what does one do with the 12 and 12? Definitely read it. But it's one of those situations, it's a little bit like, as Bill sees it, or Living Sober, is if there's something useful in there, which is consistent with the big book, then use it. If something is inconsistent, don't worry about it. And I keep it as simple as that. On the subject of Bill, now, none of us would be here if it wasn't for Bill and his spiritual experience and his tireless dedication over decades. And I'm not just talking about the beginning of AA, I'm also talking about the traditions and then the establishment of the concepts which created a structure which is seeing us through rather well, considering who we are. And so I'm very hesitant to say anything against Bill, but he's not always the best guide in his later writings as to how one should work one's program. So the content is very good, but better to stick to the big book. And a couple of examples. When he wrote the 12 and 12, a couple of his friends said, Bill, do you think you might consider taking the steps rather than writing about them? And that wasn't without cause, because he was having a rough time. And there's a very good essay called Emotional Sobriety, the Next Frontier. And it's interesting because the next frontier makes it seem as though, think of frontiersmen in the American West. So the literal frontier of what was to become the United States of America was constantly shifting as new territories were opened up, or bought, or won, or stolen, whatever whatever verb you use, it's going to upset someone. But anyway, the frontier is moving. And so he's presenting emotional sobriety as, well, it's a new thing that we're trying for. We're trying this out. We're doing a new thing here. And he talks about depression and the merry-go-round, the emotional merry-go-round. And he goes through and he discovers that these emotions, these difficult emotions and the depression and so on, are all coming from faulty dependencies and demands that we have our own way. Now, the fact is that he actually wrote that the first line of the content bit of the programme, once we prepared for it, on page 60 of the big book, is the first requirement is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will could hardly be a success. In other words, his great discovery at several decades was the first line of the book that that section of the book that he wrote in 1939. But he's forgotten that by then, and he thinks he's found something new. And I've had that experience myself, thinking that at 15, 17, 20 years clean, that I discovered great new sources of wisdom and new ideas. And then, rather embarrassedly, I picked up a book about 25 years, which I read when I was a year sober, and discovered that all of my great discoveries when I was 20 years clean were actually there presented to me when I was a newcomer. And I'd taken them on board, but then forgotten them. And this brings us back to where we started. We don't need anything new. The existing thing works. Now, when we discuss the step 11 in the morning, which we'll be doing next week, then that includes a bolt-on section where it says, and you can also do this, you can also do that. And that's how I would use some of these extra twizzles from the 12 and 12. The book, the 12 and 12, could be considered one of the useful books which we're to adopt, whose practices we're to adopt if it's going to be helpful to us. So that's the status of it. So if it helps, use it. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. The fact is, someone says, that we ask God to direct our thinking and that it will be divorced from self-seeking, dishonest, or self-pity, self-seeking, or dishonest motives, implies that our thought lives as humans needs a lot of training. Any suggestions for helping sponsees with this? That's a very, very good point. Hmm. Um, I do a little bit of formal stuff with sponsees. There's very, very little that I do which is not strictly big book. One of them is I give them a list in step 4. So here are some standard cognitive distortions, ways in which people misapprehend what is going on, and it's so useful to be able to name those things. But I think a lot of that crooked thinking comes from you phone someone up with a situation and you say, well, I think it's like this, and they go, no, no, that's not what's going on at all. Once that's happened 2 or 3,000 times, your thinking is cleared out. You start to think like the people you're seeking counsel from. Not simply because they have some sort of magical authority, but because what they say, when put into practice, actually works. Their explanations genuinely explain. So I think it's through endless worked examples, particularly during step 4, lots of the crooked thinking gets straightened out in the page 67 questions, those 8 questions on page, some people read them as 4, I read them as 8, on page 67. And when people present their inventory, a lot of that can be discussed critically. I don't mean critically in the sense of condemnation, but critically in the sense of let's see if that's really true. Is that really the case? So that's when that gets unpicked. But step 9 does a lot of it. You go and make amends and you discover that the situation was not at all as you thought it would be. So that's your training program. Someone said, do you do a 12 and 12 book study? No. Next question. How to be happy doing... It's not because it's not a good book, but it's episodic. So there are lots of individual little books, little bits which are good, but there are whole chapters which I can't really use. You can use isolated lines, but not the structure of the chapter. The 6 and 7 stuff I find a disaster. The step 4 stuff I find a disaster. I actually quite like 10 and 11. But I can't use the step 4 material. How to be happy. Oh, I like this. How to be happy doing something God wants you to do when you don't really want to do it. There is a lot of fear attached to the task, but I've done inventory and there is still lots of fear. What do you do about the fear? Well, I'm going to be a bit naughty here, and I get this from someone else. I didn't make this approach up myself. You might want to get a pen and a piece of paper because this is quite elaborate. So the answer to that fear is stop it. That's what you do with the fear. That's the end of it. You make a distinction between the thought that presents itself to the mind and what you then do with the thought. So I have no power over the thought that presents itself. But I can make a decision, am I going to believe it? Spiritual Paul used to say, people are worried about the future, they're worried about what's round the corner. I'm not worried about what's round the corner, but my higher power's round the corner. That's who's round the corner. So God says, you'll be fine. I love you. You're fine. It's good. The world's a bit of a joke, but it always has been. But your spirit is immortal. Do your best down there, and then you can have eternity with me. Kushti, Kushti, you're done. That's God's message. And then fear comes along and says, what about that meeting next week where you have to present? Ooh. You have a moral choice. Who am I going to give the authority to tell me how to live my life, to tell me how I'm going to feel? That is the point at which I have to say to the fear, F you. We're not interested in what... Thank you for sharing. Now be off with you. We're not interested in you. We're finished. I'm going to believe what God said. God said I'm going to be alright, so I'm going to be alright. Got it? Good. And then you turn your attention to something else. In the A Course in Miracles, it says it's no good going to God asking to remove your fear when you're not doing your bit in getting rid of its cause. What is its cause? Mind wandering. Letting your mind wander where it doesn't belong. The past, the future, other people, the world, myself, my life, the results. If I will let my mind wander in those territories, fear is inevitable, and God won't get between cause and effect. If God got between cause and effect, you'd be so disorientated you'd jump off a bridge, you'd explode. So God won't do that. The cause must be removed, and the cause is for me to remove. Now, I remove that with God's help, with God's direction, with God's strength, but I've got to take the initiative. Fear is self-inflicted, resentment is self-inflicted. It takes a minute to work out, to practice not inflicting it on yourself, but don't make a mistake of thinking the fear is coming from the outside. The other part of the question, how to be happy doing something God wants you to do when you don't really want to do it. The way to solve that is to start wanting the things that God tells you to do. So if I have to do the washing up, I say to myself, I want to do the washing up. I want to go to work. The last thing you should do is say to us, I don't want to do this. If you don't want to do it, you won't want to do it. The words that I use create the reality that I live in. So the more you repeat, I don't want to do it, the less you'll want to do it. If you say, actually, I do want to do this, and keep saying that, you'll discover it's true. It's the weirdest thing. To want what you have, whatever you've got, want that. So Dag Hammarskjöld, for everything that has been, thank you. For everything that shall be, yes. Another, just couple of things, Keith, if I may. The one thing which I've thought of, there was one of the, I think, desert ascetics in maybe, I think he wrote in Syriac, called Evagrius of Pontus, which is something of a name. And he wrote a book called Anteretikos. Now, what it is, it's a list of all of the different types of intrusive thought that a person can have, which he said came from the devil. And anti-retikos literally means like retikos as in rhetoric. It literally means speaking back to the devil. And it's a list of, as I say, the intrusive thoughts, the devil's temptations to think negative or otherwise unhelpful thoughts, with the line from the Bible that is the perfect antidote. And so you get used to the book and you say, well, I'm having this thought. Aha, this is the line from the Bible. The line that you speak back is more powerful than the thought that comes into your head. Speech is more powerful than word. It's like paper, scissors, stone. The spoken word is more powerful than the thought word. So if you want, it's very easy to kill a bad thought. You speak the truth against it. Anti-retikos. If in doubt, pray out loud, sing out loud, say affirmations about God out loud. I've gone through periods of saying, God loves me, everything is all right, there is nothing to fear. God loves me, everything, and then you realise someone's listening. But better that, maybe they'll learn something. So anti-retikos is an incredibly strong practice, and Joyce Meyer, now she's a televangelist, not to everyone's taste. She's a bit funny looking as well, but she's had a lot of work done, but wouldn't you? But she's great. She looks a bit like the Joker, actually, but I shouldn't really say that. Um, but she does. But rather, she's lovely, and she has saved my life. She has saved my life, and for long periods, she has this app with a little half hour every morning, and you can't come out of that feeling anything but joyful. But she talks about the power of the word, the power of saying out loud God's truth to get the devil to go away. And almost final question, if you'll permit me, Keith, one tiny thing before the final question. Padre Pio. I was in Galway Cathedral a few months ago, and I picked up a rosary, and I thought it was a picture of Padre Pio on the rosary. And I said to the woman behind the counter, I said, "Who is that?" What I should have said, "Is that Padre Pio?" I said, "Who is that?" She said, "It's Padre Pio." As if she was talking to an idiot child. Like, why would you not know that this is obviously this little watercolor picture is Padre Pio? Like, who else? Not as though there are any other saints to choose from. Anyway, Padre Pio was famous for having encounters with the devil. One day he sees the devil in the corner, and he looks him in the eye and says, "Ugh, it's you, it's only you, Bluebeard. I thought it was someone important." And he turned over and went to sleep. So one needn't be frightened of fear. Show it who your higher power is. Show it who God is. Last question. Once your sponsees have worked through the steps, what's your frequency for talking with them? 97 kilohertz. Is the agenda for these discussions based on step 10 and 11 prompts for discussing what has cropped up during the day? My God, the last thing I want to hear is to have them drearily rehash the day. And at 3:10, I had a feeling. Can I tell you about the No, I'm not interested. Don't give a shit. I've got my own 3:10 feelings. So, two things once we've been through the steps. The first thing, quarterly review. You need to do a quarterly review. The page 67 questions suffice. A full step 4 doesn't hurt occasionally. You can use the St. Augustine prayer book. Basically, a thorough review, or even the nightly review questions are pretty good. It doesn't matter as long as you look at your whole life all at once. So we discussed that. I suggest call once a week, and as they say in military circles, which I do not frequent, although I used to be in a military band, permission to speak freely. So just say what's going on. Don't try to scrub up well. Say what's going on, but prepare in advance. Don't fumble it. You want a bit of thought to go into it. Plus any ad hoc questions. But the best thing, the thing that I always have time for, is if people need to talk about difficulties with sponsees. You really, really fuck up with the first 100, 200 sponsees. Just shit show after shit show after shit show. That's just the law. You get to 300, 400, you're kind of getting into the swing of it, 500 just swimming. But the first couple of hundred, really hard. And you need to be talking that through with people, because you're going to get a lot wrong, and it matters because it's a real human being there. So you want to be talking through how you're sponsoring others, and particularly any conversation you've had with a sponsee where you feel all tense and weird and sick afterwards. Talk about those, because your body's telling you something that you haven't noticed. That's why it's expressing itself in your body, because your cognition is not advanced enough to figure out what's gone on, and your body is saying, pay attention, something happened here. Call your sponsor immediately when that happens. If you need to buy time with a sponsee, say, "I'll call you back later." Whenever you hear that from a sponsor, that means they're talking to their sponsor. So brace yourself. There we go. That's all I've got, Keith.